Hello all, and welcome to another edition of the Low-Code Café. This is episode number 145 for September 2023. Today we're going to talk about the power of dynamic fields, and we will work on using a Json data source to populate a dynamic forms and talk about what's needed to handle data form once it's submitted. Before we get into all that, let me introduce myself. I am Dale Warner, Head of Support for Plant and App. I am capably joined today by Patrick Anderson, Technical Success Manager for Plant and App, and we're glad you're here. We will be getting into that, but first let's just say that introduce this webinar. It's a webinar that we do every other Wednesday at this hour, where we demonstrate our product, where we talk about things coming up in our product. The biggest part of it is dedicated to hands-on low coding. So we are glad that you're here. We will give you stories and tips, and we invite you, if you have an implementation of Plant and App that would be of interest to our community, to be our guest speaker. Some of our most successful episodes have been guest speakers. We record all these, put them out on YouTube. So we've got 144 hours of great training content already out on YouTube. You can get to that through youtube.com/plantandapp. So do subscribe to that. Today, our agenda is that we'll talk about from the trenches of support. I have a few topics to talk about, mostly about hotfixes. And then we'll get into our hands-on low-code development, the dynamic fields. Do engage with us. You can use the chat window or question and answer. You can raise your hand and talk. And when it's all over, do give us some feedback. It's on our feedback form that you'll see as part of the emails that we send to you. We do this every other week, as I mentioned, and the next live one is scheduled for October 4th. And that will be part 2 to this episode, where we take what we've learned about dynamic fields and go deeper using some AI thoughts. So from the trenches of support, the main topic today is hotfixes to version 1.25. Our development team has been busy working on a number of hotfixes. So we've previously released 36. Today there are 8, and they're a little hard to count because we've each hotfix includes lots of other content. So let's get into it. This is just one hotfix, and it's to Form Builder. And I wanted to point out that this particular one has some great new features, but we have discovered at least one bug. A client has experienced a bug with it. So as we often say with hotfixes, if you don't need it, don't install it. If you do need it, just be aware of what the impact might be to you. So this one's a little hard to explain, but let's get into the features first. So within this, we now allow dates outside of the constraints. So you can say that you can't enter a date off into the future or in the past, but if that's part of your data, that it's now allowed. So that's a nice addition to the dates and date and time picker. We have a new experimental hierarchical data source in both dropdowns, in dropdown with checkboxes. And so this will be useful for when you're trying to expose something that has parents and children. And this was a nice new feature added to forms. We also threw in some fixes with this enhancement. So if you're using the execute actions asynchronously action, we were seeing some intermittent issues, and so that's been fixed. And then the dynamic number field, a maximum value, wasn't working, and that's been fixed. In order to use this hotfix, it has to be installed together with a specific version of App Builder, which is also on the list. So you're going to want to do both. If you do one, you're going to want to do both. And then the warning that a particular feature, the execute actions for each list entry, the context behavior setting changed slightly. You can work around it quite easily, but if you haven't, if you don't know about it, it might cause you some grief. So we're just mentioning it, and it's a little hard to get into, but I'll point to where the feature is. This is the action, and this is the feature that we're talking about. And if you rely on specific settings of this, you might need to take a look at your code to take advantage of this hotfix. And we are working to put the behavior back the way it was. Again, contact support if you have questions about that. So the next two bug fixes, one is in tabs. So the Bootstrap 3, which again is kind of, we are encouraging everyone to upgrade to Bootstrap 5, that we will not indefinitely support the older Bootstrap 3. But we had a problem in Bootstrap 3 where opening a tabs in a pop-up or modal wasn't working, and now that's fixed. And within our data model, the second fix is that the detail page, when we generate code, when you create an entity, it wasn't correctly handling when you had multiple documents. So we've improved our code for what's automatically generated. And this next one is kind of interesting. We now have the ability to execute a workflow generically, that you reference it by its GUID, its ID number, and you can execute the workflow that way, which allows you to have to dynamically select which workflow you want to run based on conditions. So that's potentially useful as you're doing dynamic code. And this one comes with the warning that you have to install that other one via the previous hotfix I mentioned, 5.2580 of forms or higher. And so that gets into, you still have to investigate the context behavior question that I mentioned. Anyway, another fix is in listing builder, where we corrected the way that when you're searching, that the tab name, when you're using listings together with tabs, that we fixed the way that that gets appended so that it doesn't mess up your search as you're tabbing back and forth. And data source inline add for some reason wasn't working, so that's a fix. And the help text for what font awesome we support has also been updated. So several little fixes. And then the last four are easy. We did one security change in 4 different areas. So that's 4 separate hotfixes that you'll see to install. And so if you have something showing up as a penetration test issue that needs to be cleared up, you can install these hotfixes. Great. So beyond that, as I do weekly, I encourage you to engage in Campfire. It's an activity that we do every Friday this same hour, and it's more of a conversation format instead of a teaching or lecture format. So gives you a chance to engage with your fellow low coders, and we often see problems solved in that hour, and it's a good time besides. So do engage with us in Campfire, and we'll have the link for that. And Patrick is going to take care of it. He's on the ball. He's already got them in the chat. So the links for this episode, where you can sign up for Low-Code Campfire, where you can get to our recordings, get to our community portal, or give us feedback, all there on the clipboard. And then I've posted a couple of pointers to our documentation about where you can get started with the dynamic fields that we're going to talk about today. So we got through that, 50 minutes to go. We'll get into our low coding now with dynamic fields. So this is going to be a two-parter, and the today's focus is on dynamic fields. So we're going to talk about how to populate a form with dynamic fields, and then talk about how to process the data when the form gets submitted. That's our objective today, and we'll also cover why dynamic forms and all of that. Part 2 will just be an interesting implementation of why you might use dynamic dynamic form fields. And so we'll combine that with some artificial intelligence and showcase a job application that digs in deeper as an applicant answers questions. The questions that they will answer next are dynamically generated. So you now get a job application that's customized to the applicant and digs deeper into their specific experiences, kind of more like an interview than a fill in the form. So that's where we're going with this, and that ought to be interesting as well. So the big overview of where we're going today, we'll talk about why do dynamic fields at all, and then what are the components that are involved in putting dynamic fields onto a form. We'll talk about what data we're going to use and why you use data when you're creating them. We'll actually then spend most of our time in creation logic. How do you create a dynamic form, and then what to do when they submit the form. So that's our big overview for today. So the first one is why use dynamic fields at all, and the purpose of the feature is to let you place fields on a form based on whatever conditions that you want to evaluate as the form gets displayed. So normally you would use a form to collect static information. You know that you want to collect name and address, and so you put first name, last name, email address, whatever on the form. Form's very simple. But if you want to create a form custom to the circumstance, that's what dynamic fields is all about. So this, I've just thrown out a couple, 3 use cases of possibilities here. Like in e-commerce, you might want to change what the form looks like depending on what shipping or payment method they're using. In a medical setting, you might want to generate additional fields based on the health conditions that they've already specified in an earlier stage. And the one that we're going to focus in on, a job application that changes based on the position the applicant is applying for. So that's where we're going. And let's start with an example. We'll take a look at a form that prompts different questions based on options when the form loads. It's all about the data. So let's clear that out. So I have a form here that is asking 3 different questions with 3 different kinds of answers. So this is a short text answer, a long or large text answer, and a drop down. And this is all being generated dynamically. It's generated dynamically based on data. And if we ask a different set of questions, the form will render completely different. I've got it set where it's responding to the URL. And so when you do this other one, instead of asking 3 questions, it's asking 5. You can, these are all drop downs, so you get a totally different type. When you answer them, we'll just illustrate that the submit button can retrieve the questions and the answers off of the form. So you dynamically place information onto the form, dynamically pull information off the form. So that's where we're going. And so let's move on. There's really, at its core, there's 2 components to creating a dynamic form. One is that you need a dynamic field container. It tells the form builder where to put these dynamic fields on your form, because you can have a combination, right? You can have static ones like name and address that you always ask, and then you have these additional questions that might be variable. We're going to focus on just a completely dynamic form, but in any case, you need a container to put these into, and then you use actions to insert those into the dynamic container. So we're going to do a quick exercise and show in a nutshell how to use these components. It's not going to be it's not going to be the code that you're going to eventually use and that we're going to get into, but it just shows quickly the way these two things go together. So let's start with that. And I have an empty Plant an App implementation, Plant an App website that we'll use to do this. So starting from scratch. So to do this, I am going to go and create a page that's going to be specifically for this. And so we'll just create a new page called the manual method. And we will make this available to all, and we'll make our developer roles available to edit the page and save it. So this that one change adds our manual method page, and so with that, I'm going to put the page into edit mode, and we'll add an action form. I'm going to clear out this thing that I never need. It comes from my template of creating a page, and we'll add an action form. We'll go into manage it. And this is going to, we'll start it out with it being a blank form. We're going to call this the method form. And so as I said, there are these two components. One is the dynamic field container, and then the other is the actions that fill up that container. So from on your field layout, you can add a dynamic container, and that is it's hidden. You don't actually see the container on the container itself has no rendering, so it's in our hidden data area, and so we just add one. And it doesn't matter what you call it, but we need to call it something, and I'm going to call it DC1, Dynamic Container 1. You could have multiple dynamic containers on a page. Beyond that, you don't have to configure anything. There's a few more things that you could, but you don't have to do anything more than that. And then, as I pointed out earlier, you use actions. They're located in the dynamic fields add section to populate that. So we can go into our events where this form is getting billed, and on the pre-init, we can add a variety of dynamic fields are available to add into that container. So let's do a very typical one. Let's say that we want to collect the first name and the last name. And so we can add a text box. So this is the add text box action. Comment, and so the place that we want to put it is DC1. Everything has to have a field ID, so you have to come up with something. You have to have a system for naming this uniquely. I'm just going to call this Q1. It doesn't matter what I call it, but just it has to be unique within this form. The title of this is going to be first name, and we could provide a description. We could do an initial value if we wanted. We could make this required, and I will make it required. So it is required. You'll see it's not a checkbox here. Everything is tokenizable here, and we try to stay away from checkboxes in creating these because they're all going to be created in code. So we'll say, yes, it's required. And so that gives us the prompt for first name. So this action, when the form loads, is going to add first name to the field, to the form. And I'm going to clone this to do last name as well. So we'll just make some quick changes. This has to be unique, so we'll pick another name, or ID rather. And the rest of it is correct. And so we don't even have to have a button to illustrate that this works. So I'm going to save it, and we'll take a look and see what it does. So when the form renders, we now, it has into this DC1 area, we've put first name and last name. And let's advance this just a little bit more, where we'll put a button on the form. And so we'll have a submit button, and we can use a display error message action to display the fields. And so if you remember, this is their name is Q1 and Q2. So I can say Q1 and Q2 as output in this error message, just to prove that it works. So we refresh the form, let it render. And so we have first name, last name, we hit submit, and we see that the required is coming up. And when we submit, it's putting out Q1 and Q2. So that, in a nutshell, is the components of dynamic forms, dynamic field container, and an actions to whatever you want to put, whatever you want to ask your user. From there, it's code implementation to say how do you want to use those two tools to populate the form. So that's where we are. So we've done this exercise, these dynamic field components that we talked about to prompt for first name, last name. So that exercise is done. So the next question is talking a little bit about data, right? Almost always you're going to drive what you're going to collect on a dynamic form from data, because if it's not based on either data or conditions present, like values or tokens, whatever. If it's not based on data, you probably shouldn't be using dynamic forms. A regular form will do. So we're going to be using some kind of data, and then based on whatever that data is that's available when the form loads, the form's going to add dynamic fields to capture whatever you want from the user. So that's kind of it's data driven. In our example today, I have pre-built some Json that has either 4 or 5 elements. And so it's going to look like this. The JSON data will have a field ID. And so we're going to use that directly to fill in the field ID action. It's going to have a title. So experience length, for example, might be what you're prompting. And the question is, how many years of retail experience do you have? We're doing a job application for a cashier, and so we're going to ask questions related to that. And then the fourth element is, what kind of thing are we expecting? So in this case, we're going to expect a short text answer. They're going to type whatever answer they type. That's what we're going to record. And so that's one field. Another, our second field that we're going to be dealing with is a type of essay. So we have the same thing, same things. It's a field ID, a title, a question, and then it's doing an essay type. So we're going to add a large text field instead of a text field, a text box. The third one gets a little bit more interesting, a little bit harder to implement, because we're going to do a multiple choice, which will render as a dropdown. And so we still have the same field ID, title, question. And then we also are dynamically getting the choices coming from an array in the JSON. So we'll have to iterate through that and put these into the dropdown. Not that hard to do, but a little bit of extra detail. So we'll figure that one out. So this is the data that we're going to use to drive this. And then again, the beauty of doing this kind of doing it based on, in this case, a JSON structure, but any kind of data, is that when we get done, if we've done it right, we can put different data against the same form, and it will render a completely different form. All right, so that's the data that we're using. And so this is where we're going to spend the most of our time. We need to take that data, create a form. And so it's really a two-step process, pretty straightforward. We're going to create a list from the data, and then we're going to use a for each loop to go through that list, and we're going to add a couple of dynamic fields onto the form. I've chosen to do it this way just to illustrate the capabilities of dynamic fields. So I'm going to start with a static text field. That's where I'm going to put the question, and a dynamic field of whatever the right type is to accept the answer. And so that's our creation. And then we'll come back to this, but when it's time to get the data off of the form in the submit button, the absolute easiest way that I've found to do this is to store your same list data to use when you process the submit logic. So we'll also be storing that. Okay, so let's do the hands-on part of this. We're done with the manual methods, so we can close that out, and we're going to do a new page now for job application. We'll let everybody use this. And admins to edit the page. And so this gives us a blank page to work with. And so if we go to the preview of our site, we can see that we now have a job application page that we can go to. So we have to create this, we have to create the form and a dynamic container, and then we can get into this creation logic. So same steps we took earlier. We need to add an action form. And we go ahead and manage it, start out blank. Give it a name. And it needs, to start out with, we just need a dynamic container. So that again is here. And I am again going to call it DC1. And so now we get into our actions. In the pre-init, we're going to add a token, a create tokens. And this is, I don't want to worry today about where we're going to get our data. So I'm just going to paste the JSON directly into a create token. So here's the data value that we're doing. And it's same ones we were working with a minute ago. I was showing, so we're doing experience length, customer service incident, and cache management. And so this is, we're going to call this the question JSON. So in a real world scenario, you'd be getting this data from somewhere, an entity or whatever, and we will actually do that next week. But to simplify and focus in today on dynamic forms, we'll just do it that way. So this is document a little bit what these are, so we can see what what we're working with. And so as we mentioned earlier, the first step is to create a list. So you convert your data into something that you can iterate over. So we're going to search for JSON and find a handy action to do that. So what we want to do is we want to create a list from JSON. And what this will do then is we're going to create the question list from our question JSON. So the model that we're using is the JSON that we're inputting to this thing is from above. And this is not case sensitive, but I like to keep it the same case. The thing that we're creating is the question list. So this JSON will get parsed and put into question list, and so now we can iterate over it. And so that's the second action. So as mentioned before, the next thing we need to do is a for each list item. We want to be able to iterate over that and do something with it. So we will add another action, and let's see, I can't remember what, there it is. Execute actions for each list entry. It's here in list and objects. And so what we're doing is we're going to loop through the question list to create questions. So the list that we want to loop through is the same one we created here, and oftentimes easy to just copy and paste. So we have our list name that we're iterating through, and then the action list is where all of our actions are going to take place, and so we'll do that. So the first thing that we want to do is for every time we get a question, we want to add a static text field for the question so that we can see what the question is. So we can find these in dynamic fields, add static text. That's an action. And so we're going to display the question. And so now we need to know where we're going to put it. So this is the DC1, the dynamic container that we put on the field. And we need to know, we need to give it a unique field ID. So going back to looking at the JSON, the field ID is an element within the JSON called field ID. And so we're just going to use that directly. We can get to that by using this question list as is the access to the list. So we can say question list field ID. When you're working with JSON fields, this is one of the unusual areas of our product that JSON is case sensitive, and so you have to use the exact case as you find it in the JSON. So field ID, field underscore ID, we use that. And then I am going to call this the field ID underscore text because I want to differentiate this. I'm going to add another question. I'm going to use this other value for the name of the actual input field. This is what we're doing now, is just displaying a text. And so what we need then for a title, I'm going to, you actually have to have a title. It requires it. And so I'm just going to use this same thing, but it doesn't display. So it's just a requirement, interestingly. The thing that we want to display, and I'm going to put this into HTML mode to do it, but I'm going to use H3 tag. Doesn't matter. Use just a little bit of HTML here to display this thing so it comes out nice and big. So it's the question list, and then looking back, field name is called question. So question, and then I don't think I need anything more here on the bottom. So recapping, we are going through looping through all the questions in the question list and adding a static text on the page every time, putting that in the dynamic container. So I'm going to save that. We can look at this progress so far, and I like to do that to make sure that I'm doing good until we so we can build step by step and not have to go back. So now we can see that the 3 questions that are as part of this data are being displayed because they're being added as static text. I'm going to get rid of this thing that I don't need. And we'll put this form into full screen in a new tab so that we can quickly go back and forth. So we have our 3 questions on the screen, and if we go back to our steps of what we're trying to get done, we've done this first part. We've added the static text field, but now we need to actually ask the question, and this is going to mean that we're going to have to deal with response type to figure out what one we want to do. So let's start with the easiest one first, short text, right? And so this can be done. We're here on our events, and we're looping through. We have to do this inside the loop. We have to say, well, if it's a short text, then what are we going to do? So we want to add a text box. So we can do this by adding a dynamic field, add text box. We can do this with a condition. We only want to do this if the response type is short text. So we can look at our question list. And again, this matches up with the data that we have. Response type equals short text. So we're testing for that. So we're only going to do this action if it's this. We'll also do we'll separately handle the other 2, the essay question and the whatever the other name was. We'll deal with that. So the add text box has some things, and we have to fill those in. So we still want it to go into DC1, the dynamic container 1. It has to have a field ID, and then this is where I'm just going to use the question list field ID. And remember, on the last one I put underscore text. This one I'm just going to use the field ID as it is, so it's unique from all others that are present on the system. The field title, in this case, it actually needs it. This does matter. Instead of this is what's going to show up next to the field, and so we wanted to say experience length next to the field that's going to get filled in. So we will use the title. We could fill in a description. I'm not going to do that because we've pushed the question out separately. But I do want to make this required. So we'll say true. Now I'm going to close that up so we can, this is as we handle the question type, short text. So let's check our progress. We save that and refresh. We now get, for the only question that is of type short text, we're getting experience length, and it's prompting us, and so we could fill in the blank. So now we've dynamically added that action. So now we just need to go on and handle the other 2 types. So there is essay we'll do next. This is really just like text, so we'll be able to use a lot of the same answers, or at least do it in a similar fashion. So we're still inside of our loop. Instead of doing add text box, we will do the action of add large text. That's the kind that we want to do. Where is it? Large text. And so we're going to handle the question think. Yep, it's response type equals essay. So I'm going to do a little copy and paste to save me some typing. So we'll be handling this will only activate if the response type is essay. We still want to put it in DC1, and now we get into field ID, and we can do a little copy and paste again for field ID and title. So the field title is going to be that, and the field ID is going to be that. So we're getting it from the data. Then we have these other things that are specific to a large text field. So how many rows? Maybe we only want to give them 5 rows to answer, but we still want to make it required. So we can come down here and say true. And we're good to go. So let's check that progress. And refresh. So now we have asked an essay question for this customer service incident. And so we're definitely getting there. So now the last thing we need to do is to handle this third type, which is multiple choice. And now we have to deal with some extra logic to convert these into something that we can output into to be able to populate what the choices are. So a little extra work. And so to keep things nice and clean, instead of just directly adding the action here, I'm going to use one called execute actions. So the execute actions action will let us put a number of things, related actions in one spot. So we can just put the condition in once. And so this is going to be to handle the question type. And so we'll be able to use the same condition, just with a different value. And the condition we're doing is multiple choice. That's what's in the data. This set of things is only going to execute if it's a question type multiple choice. So you can see what we're building out. If you wanted to support more than 3 different types, we're handling short text, essay, multiple choice. If you wanted to add a 4th type for radio boxes, you would just add a section of code to deal with that. So what are the actions? Well, we're going to need to create a choices variable that's going to fill in the blank. And maybe we can start with the actual add action to add a drop down, and then that'll give us a nice target where we're going. So under dynamic fields, add drop down, we'll have to fill in a lot of these things, much like we've done before. And let's go ahead and do that. So we're still going to do DC1. The field ID is the same that we've used before. The field title, again, where is it? Title. And so where we get into trouble is that the data source for this is going to be items. If we can find it in the list, here it is. And we need an item list, and we don't have one. So that's where we have to build it up. We're going to, we can get ahead of things here a little bit. I'm going to build a token called choices. And so whatever the choices that we build up, that's what's going to get placed inside here. And again, we're going to call this a required field. So we're all done, except we don't have choices. So we've got to do some actions that are going to take care of that for us. And again, looking at the data, the choices that we're going to do are in an array with text values. And so we need to format this the way that items is expecting it. So we will start with, I'm going to create the choices variable as an empty thing. And so we're going to create or update a token. It's going to be called choices. And it's going to have a blank value. So this gives us the choices token. The next thing we need to do is to get this list of things in the choices list and turn it into an actual list so we can iterate through it. Again, it's a little complex, but not too bad. So, excuse me. We look through our JSON actions, and again, we're going to create list from JSON. And what we're going to create is the choices list. The value that we're going to get is from the question list, choices. So pulling it right from that same, this will put the array into, that's what we're going to be parsing. And this is going to create a list called choice list. Yep. And let's be careful with our naming. I just like to create a description just so I can see what this thing is doing. So this is going to be creating a choice thing called choice list, which I'm going to need in the next step. I'll copy that. And the next step is for each, we want to execute actions for each list entry. So everything in choice list, we want to go through and for each one that's there, we're going to update our choices. So this is not too difficult. We're going to create or update a token. The token we're going to create is the choices one, the one that we created above. And what we're going to do is all the choices that has been to date. Together with, we're going to add the choice list text value. So every time we get a new text value, we're going to append it to choices, and then this is just going to be our answers that get inserted into the question. So, yep. So the only thing that we've got to do now is put the drop down below all these things. So these first three steps creates choices. Whoops, get it where it belongs. These three things create choices. And then when we add our drop down, choices is here. Now I will say it's entirely likely that there's other ways, maybe even better ways, to create this list of choices that could be done. It's just going to depend on your data scenario. But anyway, let's save that and see where we are. So now we have our third question: how comfortable are you with cache handling? And we have our choices are appearing there. Good. So we've accomplished the first part of a dynamic form. How do you get it to build forms dynamically, iterating through data? And we could even prove our original presumption. We could ask different questions and get a different form. So if we were to go back to we're getting our data from a static field, but if we were to provide a different questions JSON and paste it here, so this is asking something completely different. It's asking some essay questions, doesn't matter what the questions are, but they're of the same format with the same JSON structure. We can refresh the form and get a completely different result. 3 questions. This happens to be 3 essay questions. So we're asking questions dynamically. I'm going to turn that one off so that we go back to our original set of questions, but we've asked it. So now can we go back to the tip that I gave, the easiest way to process these answers is if you will keep your list data available to you when you submit. This data that's coming in this case, we did it in a static way, but this data that's coming in won't be available to you when you click the submit button unless you put it on the form. So I am going to add one more field type. I'm going to add a hidden field with a custom value, and I am going to call this the hidden question JSON. Doesn't matter what you call it, but you've got to just, we're going to use it to store this information. And so in our events, I'm going to add one more event. It is a token event where we're going to populate the hidden question JSON with this value question JSON so that it's actually on the form, and then we'll get passed to the submit button. So that's the easy way to implement the tip. When we save this, it absolutely doesn't, we're going to go back to our original form, but it doesn't look any different. That hidden field doesn't show, but it's actually there and is going to be available to the button. So we're on to our final step, which is we're going to have to handle our submission logic. How do we want to use that we just hid to create a list from it, and then use that to extract data from the field. Let's do a little walk before we run. So let's add a button. We go back to our fields, add a button. This is going to be the submit button. That's fine. It's going to cause validations while our required fields are required. We can add a click handler that is an error message. So we can just prove that this form is working. So there is a, let's see if it's published or unpublished. Yes. In DC1, there are some things that get created, and one of them is, this is our field container. You can get the JSON, or you can get something called a query string. And this is one way to output values. So I wanted to cover this quickly in case we ran out of time. We can take DC1 JSON and output it. And so whatever the form has, that JSON will be output. So we now have a button. We try and submit. We get them. These are all required. And so when we click the button, we're outputting our values. And so you can see it's given us a JSON structure that has it has everything from this dynamic container. So it has our questions, but it also has the question 1 and the answer 5 years. It has question 2 with the answer of no. It has question 3 with the answer of somewhat comfortable. So that's the quick way to get the data off. But the problem with this is that if your form doesn't know exactly what the question IDs are, it's a little hard to use this data. But if you use the tip I gave you earlier, it will make processing through that quite easily. So on our submit, instead of doing this display error message, we can false this out. So we're not going to display that error message anymore. But instead, what we want to do is we'll create a thing called output values and make a nice clean display. So we're going to create a token going to be called output values. And it's going to be blank. So we'll say this is going to be initialize output values. That's our description. But we're going to now create a list from JSON, as we've done twice before, but out of that hidden JSON model. So the hidden question JSON, we'll copy that field ID from here so we don't have to type it. So we'll put that in brackets. That's what we want to parse. And this is going to create our question list again. So now we can walk through question list and pull off what we need to pull off. From there, we will do an execute actions for each. And so I'll do a for each search and get to that one. We're going to want to walk through question list. So we'll put it here. And what we're going to want to do is every time we get a new question from our original, here's what we asked, we're going to go retrieve the answer. And it's kind of interesting how we do this. So that's going to be we're going to create or update a token. The token that we're going to create or update is this output values one that we just initialized. And what it's going to get set to is we're just setting up an append scenario. So whatever the value was before, plus we want to get some other things. So we have our question list title, which was the original, the title that we put next to the question in the first place. So this is going to nicely identify it. Then I'm going to use an equal sign, and what we're going to want to do, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, we're going to use the question list field ID. So the question list field ID is going to be some value like question _1, question _2. But if we wrap that in another layer of brackets and change the recursion to 2, this says the inner one is going to get evaluated and it's going to pull back question _1 or question _2. And then the brackets outside will cause it to be evaluated again. And so now it's going to go to the form and get the value of question 1 or question 2 and output it. So we're outputting all these values all in one spot. And so this leaves us nothing more to do than to display it. So we can use display error message to get that done. And what we want to do is just do output values. And that should do it if I'm anywhere close. And I'm very comfortable making change. And I had an error, so I didn't do that right. I don't know if I can find the error in 2 minutes. This would be a great time, though, if you have any questions to put on a question. So let's see. So we have output values. Question JSON to question list to there's the problem. This doesn't belong here. It doesn't need to happen for each question, but rather it needs to happen at the end. So save that, maybe we'll get a better result. So experience length 5 years, customer service incident is there, cache management is there. We could format this nicely by putting in some breaks or things like that. But it illustrates that we can iterate through the questions, get the answers, and then do something with it. And so what I would anticipate doing, for example, next week is to take all these answers, whatever the questions that are there, whatever the answers that come, we'll stuff them into an entity so that they can be recorded and processed. But that, in a nutshell, is the way to get information to be able to prompt dynamically using dynamic fields, how you might iterate through the data to get them placed. There's all kinds of different field types to do there, so you can make your form look like you want it to. And then submitting, how do you handle iterating through the questions to get the answers back off the form. Since I see there are no questions, I'm going to say thank you for joining us this hour. We look forward to doing it again with you in 2 weeks' time, where we'll implement the AI part of the solution and turn it into a very interesting job application. Thanks for joining. See you then.